by putting sexualized material in front of boys, in front of young men, how do you not know you've suddenly piqued their interest? In what? Especially with the links that are in some of this material, it sends them where? To X-rated films, X-rated websites.
Out in schools, yeah.
Okay, so now, how do you not know you have a Ted Bundy? Would Ted Bundy have become Ted Bundy according to Ted Bundy? You can't believe Ted Bundy. Oh, but we can believe guys wearing women's underwear in drag? Really? Ted Bundy had nothing to gain. He was going to the electric chair. He gave one interview. That was James Dobson. He only gave one. Why did he give it to Dobson? He, through his attorney, Bundy did, contacted Dobson because Dobson was saying pornography is addictive. Bundy said this, pornography is addictive. He took responsibility, but he said if it weren't for pornography, he probably wouldn't be sitting in the electric chair by that time, just a few days after the interview. If you start to create sexual predators, how do you know? Can you tell that in the eyes of a young man that's sitting in the desk? No, you can't. You, Mr. Administrator, Mr. and Mrs. Board Member, Mr. and Mrs. Administrator, what I tell you, what my contention is this, you will see an increase in sexual assaults on your campuses. And are you going to report those? Are you going to report those properly? Because there will be an increase in sexual assault. And don't you dare reframe and tell your girls that they need to be more understanding because these boys are they're confused and they're just touching other girls' breasts in the hallways. Don't you dare dumb down the definition of what sexual assault is.
Right.
You will have, by creating a sexually charged milieu in your learning environment, you will guarantee an increase in sexual assaults among your student body of minors, and you will be held accountable for it.
We are so pleased to have Jon Uhler with us again tonight to continue with part 2 of last week's discussion. Tonight's topic is analyzing sexual predatory behavior and systemic grooming in the education system. Jon is a therapist, a certified clinical trauma professional, and a certified sex offender treatment provider. His extensive clinical practice makes him exceptionally qualified in his field, and we're so grateful that he's able to join us once again to expand on last week's theme. The interview we're going to watch was pre-recorded and runs a little over 2 hours, which sounds like a lot, but it contains critical information to counter what we're facing as a society, and it's imperative that we understand the evil people and agenda we're dealing with. The information in Jon's presentation is of such a high caliber, you won't want to miss a moment of it. So I invite you to make yourselves comfortable as we join the conversation between Tanya and Jon Uhler.
Well, thank you, Heather, for that fine introduction of Jon. Jon, welcome back to the show. Last week we ran out of time and we covered so much. We have had tremendous amount of feedback. I've had counselors and other individuals who said that they were actually watching the program several times to try to absorb all of the information. I think based on what society is facing right now with this, I'm going to say it's basically a global attack, against the natural family, but specifically against our children. And the sexual deviants, as you say, these white collar sexual psychopaths are the ones that we need to learn to understand. And you were able to walk us through that last week in a way that it made me think differently about the people that even I, in my position with Action for Canada, as we're creating the notices of liability and asking people to go into the school boards, dealing with ministers of education and government officials thinking, how can they do this? how can they go along with, the sexualization and sexual exploitation of our children and the mutilating of our children and giving them drugs? I have been just at such a loss. But after listening to you last week, it helped put things in a different perspective. So I'm looking forward to your presentation and to, how you're going to further educate us on this. I found it extremely helpful, and we've had a very, very positive feedback from the public. So thank you. And you know what? On that, I'm just going to hand the floor over to you.
Well, Tanya, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back with you. And I know where we left off last time. And again, happy to jump back into this. And it is affirming and thinking about the trans deception, as I call it. But it is heartening to know that people are finding this helpful, because I think it really demystifies this entire topic, this subject of psychopathy and sexual psychopaths, and how people end up preying upon those that are vulnerable. So we'll just pick up where we left off last time. We're going to go through a series of slides that I utilize in both my Friday night program. You can find that on tecn.tv. Friday nights, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, called Journey to Healing. And I created a number of screenshots, as it were, to help people understand this process. So we'll kind of do an overview very quickly of how someone becomes psychopathic. Now, as far as the literature, as far as the science, as far as those that are in the field that speak to the issue of psychopathy, I want people to understand that there is science behind it. They've been able to scan the brains of psychopaths. And so there's no question that a psychopath's brain now works differently. That's different than the gray and white matter. This is how it processes things. This is how it sees things, as it were. So you can put it under a scan. You can see colors as far as where activity is, and where activity is in a normal person's brain that has a conscience, has empathy, has remorse. A lot of activity in the frontal lobe, in the in the orbital area. That's where somewhere in there is conscience. So someone who has a conscience doesn't have to think about how they will respond, especially when it has to do with impacting someone else. And that's what our conscience is there for. Our conscience is designed to keep us on our side of somebody else's boundaries. But boundaries separate things of importance. So to the extent that I care about you as much as I care about me, I will keep myself in check. And therefore, my conscience will be active. It'll be effective. It'll be that still small voice. For those of us that are Christians, I believe the Lord uses our conscience to get our attention. And so if you ask a normal person if they want to violate their conscience, a normal, healthy person will say, no, I don't want to have a hardened heart. I don't want to have a hardened conscience, because they value their conscience. They know what it's there for. But if you started to violate your conscience, eventually, strangely enough, you would go through several different stages, I think about 8 to 10 stages. And eventually you would get to a point where, actually probably about 10 stages, you'd get to a point where you actually were not just okay without having a conscience or not having a conscience, but you would actually enjoy it. You'd actually be very free, and you would start to have disdain for those that do have a conscience. And eventually you would experience two things if you were a psychopath. And there's two kinds. The kind that we most typically think of, that's called a bloody psychopath. These two terms come from Dr. Robert Hare out of the University of British Columbia, the author of the PCLR, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. I'm certified in that forensically. He coined two phrases, the bloody psychopath and a white collar psychopath. Bloody psychopath, that's self-evident. That's what most of us think of. That's what I thought of before working in the prison system. But Dr. Robert Hare referenced a white collar psychopath. He's also written a very good book called Snakes in suits. So snakes in suits. A snaky kind of person in a three-piece suit. Where do we find that person? We find them in politics. We find them in finance. We find them in the ministry. 2 Peter chapter 2 describes that. 2,000 years old, Peter was talking about exactly the description of someone that has no conscience. And he is working people and he's helping himself to the cash and the women. But you notice it doesn't say small children. When somebody eventually gets to a point where they have descended through the various stages of eventually what's called deviance, and they begin to hunger after having a negative effect or negative impact, and that's what deviance is. That's what psychopathy is all about. Sociopathy is about sales. Psychopathy is about having an effect. So by the time a person, I'll focus on men right now, although you can have psychopathic women. If you've ever seen the movie Tangled, that animated film with Rapunzel, Mother Gothel was a white-collar psychopath. How about Cinderella? How about the wicked stepmother? She was a white-collar psychopath. So you can have either gender, right? Either sex. How about Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein? Both are psychopaths. You will tend to see male and female psychopaths operating in different ways. So there's pretty characteristic modes of operating. Female psychopaths will tend to be very both are calculating, but they're not going to get into this sounds interesting, but ready? They're not going to be the ones to sexually harm someone, to inflict harm. They're going to be getting the cash. They're going to be getting power out of the deal. They do love watching somebody in duress, but rare is a time that you will have a female actively inflicting sexual trauma upon someone as far as, let's say, using objects. You don't have that among the female populations of sex offenders, let's say. There's very few female sex offenders. For instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, I just spoke to this on social media because somebody was trying to equate male and female sex offenders, and there's no equating them. I'll give you an example. In the state of Pennsylvania, in the United States, you have 23 prisons. Guess how many are female? 2. Okay, so right there, they need 21 prisons for men and just 2 for women. Of the overall percentage, and this is where I will actually now bring up one of my slides, there are far more men that are sex offenders than women, number one. And the majority of women who offend, I'll prepare my little slide here behind the scenes, if I can find it. I think that's it. Yes, so now I'm going to share my screen. Rare is the time that you have a woman that's arrested for a sex offense. And generally speaking, you will have those women who either facilitated kids being a predator gaining access. So those are the ones, and I'm not justifying or minimizing any of the fact, but it's the mother that was into drugs that allowed the perpetrator to gain access. It is the woman who allowed for the filming of the child. I don't even know of a single situation. Of course, they're out there, but it is so rare to hear that a woman used an object in offending a child. You have women that are involved in trafficking other women, so female pimps. You hear about massage parlors, and oftentimes women are involved in that. It's still surreal to me, but you're not going to have typically the female who's the active party, especially when it comes to young children. Oftentimes, what you'll also read about in the newspaper, and again, anytime there's sex offending, it hits the newspaper, you'll tend to hear that there was a female teacher, either high school or junior high, and she was grooming and then exploiting young kids, either having a party, filming things, or was having sex with these kids, young boys. But typically, you're not going to have a woman I'm not minimizing. I do sex offender treatment. Right? I'm not minimizing any of this. But the reality is, rare is the time that a woman herself actually offends a child younger than puberty. For men, see it all the time. We call them pedophiles. Okay. This is a chart I put together. These are the facts based upon in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. I'm going to assume that it's probably the same in every state, every province. So what you have the bell-shaped curve here. In the US, about 1% of the population is in prison. So you notice over 3 deviations outside the norm, we've got the bell-shaped curve. From there over to the right, you have the prison population. And so I tried to show kind of populations within populations within populations. So within, not everybody that goes to prison has anti-personality disorder. Okay, so it may sound strange, but they're right. So you have some people that are able to be rehabilitated. I'll give you one example. That would be, let's say, somebody that's in for DUIs, driving while under the influence. That person can be rehabilitated if they take things seriously, drugs and alcohol. Okay, there's drug and alcohol units that go through programs. Okay, so there are offenses that somebody, if they get in a car accident, they were driving while under the influence, and now you have vehicular manslaughter. The person is in there. There is the ability to be rehabilitated, but he may be in for 5 to 10 to 25 years or longer, depending upon what he did. Okay. So within the prison population, though, you have a significant number, though, that are antisocial. Now, what is antisocial? It sounds a little different than what it really is. Oftentimes, we will use the word antisocial to mean, technically within the field of psychology, we call it asocial. So if somebody is shy, they're not called antisocial, though we say that a lot. They would be asocial. So somebody that doesn't socialize. Antisocial is someone that goes against the norms or mores of society. Now, you can tell, depending upon the society, you can have fewer or, that can fluctuate. But antisocial personality disorder is part of what's called the cluster B of personality disorders. That has to do with those that are going to be very dramatic, very self-centered, and those that will cross boundaries. So antisocial personality disorder is someone who, the easiest way to view it is this: they give themselves permission to craft the rules themselves, and they are not going to be hemmed in by society's norms. It tends to be, antisocial personality disorder tends to be impulsive by degree. They will have a history, a paper trail of bumping up against and crossing societal norms and rules. So they will typically have a number of arrests. And these are the ones that tend to stand out. Rare is the time that you have antisocial personality disorder that doesn't stand out. And there's a misnomer that says psychopaths have antisocial personality disorder. That is not true. Not all of them. Okay. As a matter of fact, I would say the ones that we're concerned about for this program, the ones that I'm concerned about, the sophisticated sexual psychopaths, sexual predators, they are not antisocial. Let me qualify that again. Are they normal? No. Do they appreciate society's norms? And no. But they fit in well. Why? Because they're calculating. You don't run for political office if you are antisocial. Why? Because you have a criminal history. Okay, you appear smooth. You appear congenial and affable and likable. An antisocial personality is not likable. Okay, you can, when you meet somebody that has antisocial personality, you really know up close and personal very quickly. Okay. And again, they're not impulsive. The sophisticated psychopaths are very methodical. Within that overall rubric of antisocial personality disorder, you then will have, in my estimation, sociopaths and psychopaths. And then we're going to get into what's called the sexually violent predators, SVP. And then within sexually violent predators, which that is a designation, by the way, given by a judge, at least here in the US. Okay, there is no law that says if you break certain laws, you get SVP designation. You don't. That is added to a judge. So in a way, there's not consistency as far as who gets SVP and who doesn't. Trust me, there's a lot of people that should be given SVPs that have not. I'll give you one example. Jimmy Hinton, Pastor Jimmy Hinton's father, Jimmy Hinton and I started churchprotect.org. We started because we found there was commonality in our concern for protecting kids in churches. His father was a pastor for about 25 years or so, was perping on his own kids. They homeschooled, was perping on his own daughters, kids in the congregation, and kids in the community for years and years. So there's a guy that is truly a sexually violent predator, yet the judge was going to give him that label, but the inmate, senior Mr. Hinton, who's now going to essentially serve life in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, given his age, I think he got 25 to 50 years. He should have gotten life. He appealed to the judge to not give him that designation, and the judge agreed. It's like, whatever, it's surreal. But Hinton knew that if he goes to prison and he's called an SVP, he's an easier target. So he was able to finesse the judge. So again, as we talked about last time, a sophisticated psychopath knows how to manage impression and work the crowd. So a child predator is among those that are SVPs, and you can have a sexual violent predator designation placed upon you if you harm women. So let's say you are raping a bunch of women. You're a serial rapist. You will be called a sexual violent predator. If you go after children, it's much easier typically to have that designation placed upon you. But look at how few there are. All things being equal, you're almost in 5 deviations outside the norm. But I want to tell people that for my purposes in trying to awaken people to the dangers of predators in churches and those that are the most sophisticated, we're talking about the men in that far right box. How many of those does it take to endanger a church full of people and especially kids? It only takes one. Why? Because do you know how many victims they will have? The average pedophile has hundreds of victims by the time they're busted. Why? Because, and what's it take to create a victim? A single incident. Okay, this man, senior Hinton, was actually abusing kids when he would baptize them. He would put his finger inside the girls' vaginas while he was baptizing them. Let that sink in. This is how vile we're talking about. Okay, so the concerns I have are for those men, because SVP child predators, do you know they're not doing life? Well, there will be some that will be in for life, but it is possible, depending upon how you were assessed and what kind of sentence was handed down, you could be out in 10 years. And I'll tell you where those men are typically going to go. They're going to go to church. Why? Because most churches will open their arms to these men. Now, if the man had stolen money from the bank account, he'd never be welcomed back. But somehow we're going to view these men as like David and Bathsheba. Folks, these are not David and Bathsheba. As a matter of fact, I will make the case that Judas was a psychopath. You have to be pretty bad for Satan to possess you. But I don't believe Judas would have offended a child. I would have been okay having Judas babysit my kids. That may sound strange, but I wouldn't worry about him perping on my kids. Now, stealing from my bank account, yes, but I don't think he would have perped on kids. Okay, so again, the little tiny boxes over on the right is the folks that we're focusing on now. How do you spot them in a crowd? You don't, because the further someone goes outside the norm, they either look really whacked out or they look really normal. I'm going to now show you how this plays out in a way. Here's a graphic from my program, From Journey to Healing. I will then show you the rest of the charts as far as what I found as I was dealing with these men in prison. But here's the best way to understand psychopaths and psychopathy. As you go down, and I guess this is the other one, I have another chart that actually lists, and I'll tell you where those are, as far as narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy. Okay. We have our two little people up here, and this will pertain to what we're dealing with now in sexual psychopaths and the dangers of the trans movement, by the way. Our little guy on the right, you see these two people as they are traversing, they're either going up or going down on their journey of life. The person on the right doesn't have any knapsacks. The knapsacks represent the person's responsibility to do what is right, just, and fair. That comes out of Proverbs chapter 1 and chapter 2. So Paul told people, each man should carry their own load, but we bear one another's burdens. The Greek word for burden is boulder. But we are to each own our own load. That's a knapsack. So our knapsacks constitute our responsibility to treat each other properly. But to the extent that I begin to care more about myself than someone else, I will start to objectify someone else. So instead of loving people and using things, the more I get into selfishness, the more I start to descend into the minus numbers, my ego grows and your value decreases in my eyes. And so I will begin to use you. And I will do that by taking my responsibility to do what is right, just, and fair, and begin to place it on you. So a dysfunctional relationship, by the way, is a one-up, one-down relationship. Person on the right doesn't have any knapsacks. Now, the further somebody goes downhill, they will inevitably start to use other people for all they're worth. So they will begin to gather to themselves, they will begin to manipulate people on the way down as far as revealing who they are in a masterful way, who they, meaning the person on the right. So the person on the right, in this current relationship, we call it a toxic relationship. It's all one way. We have the person on the right being the dumper, person on the left being the dumpee. Now, what does this have to do with psychopathy? Question is this: we know this person on the right is at a -4 at this point. That's their character. They're entering the pig zone. The question is, if I were to ask you, well, we know he's at a -4. What number could he possibly actually be? Instead of morphing, maybe he currently is. Could he possibly be a -10? And he portrayed himself originally, once upon a time, as a +10, +9, way up there. And then little by little, what did he do? He started conning people around him. And little by little, he started to cross boundaries. And he started to work people to where, little by little, they don't see what's happening. They don't see how he's grooming them. He's crossing boundaries. We could do this with time, effort, energy, and resources, and also sexually. This man right now, he's taken the person on the left from a healthy relationship to a reasonable relationship to an unreasonable relationship to an unhealthy and to a toxic relationship. Do you think the person on the right is going to stop there? Probably not. He's going to continue down. If he continues down, he will go through a twisting process. So you see what's called the twisting zone. And he will end up with what the Bible calls a reprobate mind in Romans chapter 1. 2,000 years ago, that is a metallurgy term, meaning it's no longer good for its intended purpose. The person who chooses, the person on the right, chooses to allow selfishness to grow, they will violate their conscience. Therefore, they will not be sorry any longer. That's a lack of remorse and therefore lack of empathy. They don't care what happens to someone. By the time somebody becomes that selfish, they're going to now layer on top of their selfishness things that appeal to them. You can have a financial psychopath. So this is 2 Peter chapter 2. You can have a sexual psychopath. Oftentimes, those two things are layered because money, sex, and power, they all tend to go together. As a man descends downward, what starts to happen to him? Well, he starts to go through various changes and various stages. If anybody's familiar with the verse that it says that the wolf, as it were, comes to do what? The thief comes to do what? To steal and destroy. Look at the far right categories there. So the best way to understand sexual perpetration is to understand someone going downhill. As someone gets into selfishness, it grows. They first will become a narcissist. What is that? You are the center of the universe, and you have a great self-esteem. Whacked out self-esteem, but there's nothing wrong with your self-esteem, right? It's all about you. The more that develops, people are either going to catch on real fast, so you're going to be an unsophisticated narcissist. Not a lot of people want to be around you, right? Because they have to give you accolades, they have to feed your ego, or you're going to be a smart narcissist where people won't catch on. Well, how do they not catch on? You perfect the art of sales. Now you're a sociopath. And you'll operate on cost-benefit analysis. When the cost outweighs the benefits, you will move on. If you continue down, though, now you've already established a good self-esteem, not a healthy self-esteem, but there ain't nothing wrong with your self-esteem. You feel entitled, and you're developing the art of the sale or sales, right? How to win friends, influence people. I'm not saying Dale Carnegie was a sociopath, okay? But how many sociopaths go into sales, right? If you step onto a car lot, people have objectified you financially already, and they're going to take whatever you say as far as, well, here's our budget. They're going to blow right past your budget and upsell you. Why? For your benefit? No, but they're going to make sure, ideally, that you have a great customer experience, paying more for what you never intended to. That's a sociopath. Even though they know you may end up having that car repossessed because you can't make your payments. They got you into more car than you could afford. Okay, so he's not looking out for your best interest. That's a sociopath. But if that person continues into or allowing ego to grow, they will eventually morph into someone that isn't just about sales, but effect. Now, what drives them and motivates them and what they hunger and thirst after isn't the goods, aren't the goodies, but the impact they can have over you. Now you're under their thumb. That's power and control. But then it's going to go one step further. It's going to be, I'm going to scar and mar your soul. I'm going to leave a lasting impact. And then if you dare try to stop me, if you try to put boundaries up, if you try to place my responsibility back on me, now you will pay. And that's exactly what Satan is like. How dare God think he's God? So Satan's going after God. Okay, that's why by that time you harmonize with evil. Okay, so in the sexual realm, as the person continues downward, they're going to go through different stages of motivation. So over on the far left, that's not as bad as the far right. So on the left, the initial goal is to blemish the victim's sense of normalcy. Now, this is deviance, by the way. So I'm already into having a negative effect. So I want to blemish them. I want to make it so that they are, they don't feel pure anymore. They don't feel eligible for good things. So I'm corrupting and I'm perverting and I'm warping them. Try 50 Shades of Grey. That's exactly what this is. Right? You're going to corrupt, you're going to pervert. Look at Soji Sex Ed, sexual orientation and gender identity material that's being pumped into schools. This is exactly what this is.